Hey everybody, Xile here again. Yes, we're doing another one of these. This is an Xile rant video. I have no script, no fancy editing. It's just me riffing it basically. The topic of today's video is tariffs. Hooray! Everybody loves the tariffs. I touched on them very briefly in my last video, but I only dedicated about 5 minutes to them. And first of all, almost everything I said in that video is out of date because I made that video before Liberation Day, April 2nd. So I wanted to come back and sort of dive a little bit deeper into the whole tariff of it all. We'll start with kind of going through the actual macroeconomic problems with tariffs. We'll do a bit of Econ 101. Then we'll move into a timeline of the actual events that happened on April 2nd and in the month since then. Then we'll talk about the negotiations, how I think those are going to go, and we'll look at a couple specific countries. And then finally we'll wrap up with the stated goal, which is industrial growth in the United States. And then I'll give some final closing thoughts there at the end. You may be wondering, isn't this video a little late? Didn't he, do the whole Liberation Day thing like a month ago? And well, yes, you're right. There are two reasons for that. Number one, I don't want to happen to this video what happened to my last video, or I should say my last Xile Rants video, where basically I made that video about the Russia-Ukraine war, and that was I released it 3 days before the infamous Zelensky-Trump meeting in the White House. So then basically by that point everything I said in that video was out of date, and it's only been like 2 months since I made that video, and the situation has completely changed. They've lost Kursk, but they've pushed the Russians back in Pokrovsk. I don't have time to get into all that. Maybe I'll do a part 2 in another couple months if a ceasefire deal gets closer to being hammered out. But the point is, I didn't want to make this whole video about tariffs and then Trump to come out the next day and be like, actually, we're reversing everything, yada, 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 which over the past month has happened. He has taken one step forward, one step back, one step forward, one step back, to the left, to the right, up, down, whatever. He's very mercurial, I guess is the word. And the other reason, and the real reason, is that I was on vacation and I couldn't be bothered to bring some of my equipment. So yeah, there you go. Okay, with all that out of the way, let's jump into the whole tariff of it all right? Okay, here we go. Economics 101 time with Xile. All right, so we'll start with this graph on the left here. This is a very classic supply-demand graph, okay? So the y-axis here is the price. Let's assume that this is for a specific good. Let's assume that this is for cookies, okay? Say this is for cookies. So here, this vertical axis represents the price of the cookies, and the x-axis, the horizontal axis, represents the quantity of the cookies, okay? Now these lines here are called the supply curve in red and the demand curve in blue. Where the supply and demand curve meet is the price point at which a certain quantity of cookies will be sold. So in other words, let's say that this Q here represents 200 and this P represents $2. That means that by the invisible hand of the market, this economy allows for 200 cookies to be sold at $2 a piece. Okay, does that make sense? Great. So where do tariffs come in? So tariffs are essentially a tax on foreign-made goods, right? So what that does is it lessens the incentive for manufacturers or agriculture producers, whatever, to make that good. So let's say that there was a bakery in Canada and every bakery in Canada was now paying a 20% tariff on cookies. What that would do is it would shift this entire supply curve over to the left like this, okay? Now if you notice, we are at a new point here. right? Yeah, we're at a new equilibrium point. So now the new equilibrium point is at some Q, I'll call it Q1, and is at some new P, I'll call it P1. Notice that Q is lower, is smaller. Our Q1 is lower than our original Q. I'll call it Q naught. Okay. So what that means is the market now produces less cookies, and the price here, P, is higher than our original P naught. So not only am I able to buy fewer cookies, the cookies that I can buy now cost more. So this is what we mean when we say that tariffs are inflationary. Yeah. Now apply this to, not just cookies, apply this to every single product, literally. Because we have a 10% tariff on every single country, this process repeats for every single product that you can buy. Unless you have a supply chain that is 100% in America, which is like corn and like George Foreman grills, and that's it. This process here is going to affect you. Okay? All right, now let's look at this graph on the right here. Okay? So here on the vertical axis, we have the inflation rate, something we're all very familiar with. And at the bottom here, we have the unemployment rate. Now, in traditional economic thinking, the inflation rate and the unemployment rate are inversely related. What does that mean? When the inflation rate goes down, let's say it's high up here at 10%, my unemployment rate is very low. When my unemployment rate is very high, let's say it's all the way out here, let's say it's out here at like 5%, now the inflation rate is down to 2%. And for most of economic history, this was thought to be like an unviolatable rule of economics. It was like an axiom, right? Inflation goes up, unemployment goes down. Unemployment goes up, inflation goes down. Why does that happen? Because if the unemployment rate goes up, it means the economy is in a recession. When there is a recession, people stop spending their money. The velocity of money slows, meaning there's less money circulating in the economy, meaning the cost or the prices of everything increase at a much slower rate. Okay, that's the basic premise. And then when there's a boom, the opposite is true, right? There's very low unemployment, but the velocity of money is very high. People are out there spending money, consume, and thus the inflation rate will rise. This is actually why you don't want a 0% inflation rate. 0% inflation rate is actually bad because a 0% inflation rate means a very high unemployment rate. Typically, people try to put the inflation, and by people I mean like the Federal Reserve, they try and keep the inflation rate around 2%. 2% is what's considered healthy for a normal economy or for a developed economy, okay? All right. What changed? In the 1970s, this little thing called the oil crisis, or the OPEC, embargo, whatever you want to call it, occurred. And when that happened, both the inflation rate and the unemployment rate increased. Now, this is very, very bad. It caused what's called stagflation. Why did this happen? Well, in the example I gave earlier of a recession versus a boom, the only thing that's being changed there is the demand for goods. If the unemployment rate is low, people have more money to spend because they're earning it from their wages, therefore demand goes up, right? But if unemployment is high, people have less money to spend, so demand goes down. So that was the thought. But an oil embargo affects supply because oil is used to make a lot of things, and it's used to transport pretty much everything, right? So the transportation cost of every single good is directly tied to the price of oil. So when the price of oil goes up, that directly affects supply, and that will shift this entire curve here outward like this. Okay, so now instead of following this inflation rate unemployment curve, now we're dealing with this unemployment inflation rate curve, which no matter where I peg that point is going to result in a higher inflation rate and a higher unemployment rate on average. Okay, what this also means is that in a stagflation scenario, normally institutions such as the Federal Reserve would step in and try and maintain this 2% inflation rate. But if you have stagflation, the Federal Reserve usually doesn't step in because no matter what they do, it will result in some sort of negative outcome, right? If they cut rates, well, congratulations, inflation's going to go through the roof. If they increased rates, well, congratulations, unemployment's going to go through the roof, and inflation might not even be impacted that much, right? So no matter what you do in a stagflation sense, something bad is going to happen. Okay, so that's why tariffs are bad on a sort of broad scale macroeconomic sense. And we can see the effects that the decrease in supply will have on the US economy in real time. For example, here are some pictures from the Port of Seattle. The Port of Seattle is one of the biggest cargo ports in the United States. And on this day, April 25th, it was completely empty because all of the container ships that were supposed to be coming from China and, Japan, Korea, Vietnam, places like that, simply weren't coming because people weren't ordering goods because they were much more expensive. Maybe by the time I post this won't be true, but I've seen a lot of people, if you go to the grocery store right now, you might not necessarily see the price having increased, 10% or 20% yet. And the reason for that is that before Liberation Day, pretty much every company wisely spent all of their liquid cash buying up as much inventory as they could, right? If you know these tariffs are coming, you don't know exactly what's going to happen, but you know it's going to be bad, you might as well spend a bunch of money now so you don't have to spend even more money later. And so for the past month, and probably for the next month until June or maybe July, all of that inventory will be consumed by the American consumer base. But eventually it will run out. And when it runs out, you're going to have to order more stuff from China, you're going to have to order more stuff from Mexico, you're going to have to order more stuff from Canada, and that stuff will be more expensive because you'll have to pay the tariffs, and those costs will be passed on to the consumer. So if you haven't seen an increase in the price of goods in your personal life, give it another month or two, I guarantee you it will happen. And if you're a small business owner or maybe a agricultural sector employee, I'm sure you've noticed it. If you go on r/leopards ate my face, you can find literally like hundreds of examples of small business owning Trump supporters who are just being absolutely economically devastated by the tariffs or by the federal spending cuts. So yeah, a lot of issues this is going to cause in terms of the ability of the American people to buy anything. Okay, let's get into the actual Liberation Day tariffs now. So Trump gave this hour-long speech. We're not going to watch the whole thing because, well, you've seen how long this video is. He held up this chart, or these series of charts. This column is tariffs that country charges on the U.S., including currency manipulation and trade barriers. And this column here in yellow is the reciprocal tariffs being put on them. If you notice, except for when the number is less than 20%, every other number is half of the number on the left, right? So the number on the right is, in general, half the number on the left, and that theme follows pretty consistently within a few percentage points. Okay, so what's the issue? While he was giving this speech, alarm bells were going off in my head because just calculating the tariff rate of, say, Argentina on the US would be pretty difficult, right? You have to do a weighted average of every single good, based on trade volume sent to the US, and then plug it into the mathematical formula and get some sort of number. It's not impossible, and it's a pretty straightforward formula, but it definitely would take some work to do that for every single country. Then you factor in the currency manipulation, whatever that means, and the trade barriers, double whatever that means. And you're looking at a extremely complex mathematical formula to actually figure all of that out. And, you know, a normal president, right, would have spent the 4 years he was not in power actually doing all of this legwork and, you know, making a plan, but, you know, that would require time and effort. And he's Donald Trump. He can just, you know, kind of make it up as he goes along. Art of the deal, etc. So, as a result, what I think happened, and I have some proof to back this up that we'll get to in a second, what I think happened is that a couple hours before this went live, this press conference went live, they essentially ChatGPT'd the whole thing. All right, they literally typed into AI, what is the trade deficit? We'll circle back to the trade deficit thing in a second. What is the trade deficit of Andorra on the US? What is the trade deficit of Algeria versus the US? Took that number, divided it by 2, bada bing, bada boom, there's the tariff rate. What's my evidence? Okay, let's look at some examples. The first and most obvious one was the Heard and McDonald Islands. We're charging a 10% tariff on them. What is the main economic output of the Heard and McDonald Islands? There's literally nothing because 0 people live there. Yes, we put tariffs on an uninhabited island. Why you would do that, it makes no sense if like a person were writing this, so that makes me think it was not written by a person. Another example here is the Falkland Islands. Falkland Islands are an overseas territory of the UK. It's like Guam, kind of. Like that would be the American equivalent. Why you would separate them from the tariffs on the United Kingdom, which are a completely different number at 10%, again, doesn't make any sense. So I'm pretty sure that all this justification about it being, you know, the tariffs plus the trade barriers plus the currency manipulation, all that is BS. He just did it based on the trade deficit. Okay, I got one more piece of evidence to show you. This map here is a heat map of the tariff rate of every country, okay? And this map here is a heat map of the United States trade deficit with that country. Now keep in mind that this map is in absolute amount of dollars, not a percentage. So what that means is, for example, on this map, we have a trade deficit of $617 million with Madagascar. That's a very small number, but relative to the total amount of United States-Madagascar trade, it's a significantly large percentage, which is why they're being hit with this, 30% tariff or so. Okay? So I think if we just look at these two maps, we can safely say that there's definitely some correlation here. Now, let's talk about the trade deficits themselves. The Trump administration seems to believe that we live in the 1500s, that the wealth of a nation is based strictly on how much gold you have in the coffers, how many chests of tea you have in the larder, how much iron ore you strip from the ground. This is not the 1500s anymore. The world is not a primarily resource extraction driven global economy. Especially in the US, we're more focused on services, and that is okay. That is not necessarily a bad thing. So that's the first issue. The other issue is that let's look at Lesotho, for example. Okay, so Lesotho is this tiny nation in South Africa right here. We have a 50% tariff on Lesotho. 50%. Okay. That amounts to, let's see, $185 million. What is the number one export from Lesotho? Any guesses? I don't know who I'm asking. I can't hear you even if you guess it right. The number one export is diamonds. Okay, we buy, a lot of diamonds from Lesotho. So we buy their diamonds. But the stuff that we make, Ford pickup trucks, John Deere tractors, whatever, is too expensive for them to buy in return. So as a result, we have a trade deficit with them. We have a trade deficit with them because we extract their raw materials, and it's very cheap to do so because they have a much weaker currency compared to ours. But our currency is much, much stronger because the United States dollar is the global reserve currency, and our economy is huge. And so they cannot import things from us. This also goes to countries like Japan, right? Trump complains on and on about why are we buying so many cars from Japan, but they won't buy cars from us? Well, there are a lot of reasons. It's because their cars are just better in a lot of cases. They just have higher quality. They're more reliable. The roads in Japan are also much smaller. So even like a pickup truck in Japan is the size of like a normal SUV in America. The roads are just smaller. There's less space to park in other cities. It's just a completely different philosophy, I guess you could say, when it comes to car design. Okay? Now, Trump seems to believe that there's no such thing as a fair deal. Basically, somebody always gets screwed in negotiations, and he's determined to make the United States the one that screws everyone over, not the one that gets screwed over. Okay? The problem is when you're doing that based on the numbers that he's using, right? He picked trade deficits, but he could have just as easily picked the amount of rainfall a country receives or the population of a country. He's using a completely arbitrary set of data to make these determinations. All right? We're in a situation where the national trade policy is based on a set of data completely divorced from reality. And as you can guess, that is not a good thing. Okay? So, just to summarize, the United States is a very wealthy country. That means we are easily able to buy stuff from the rest of the world, but the rest of the world cannot easily buy stuff from us. That's not necessarily a bad thing. For example, we don't subsidize these countries. We get goods in exchange for giving them all this money. When you go to a grocery store, you aren't subsidizing the grocery store by purchasing $5 worth of tomatoes. You receive tomatoes in exchange for $5. If we want to balance all of our trade deficits, that would be like going to a grocery store and instead of paying for the 5 tomatoes with currency, you would have to give the grocer shoes that you made in your basement or something, right? It's not how the modern economy works at all. All right, let's go through a little bit of a timeline here now. And we're doing this based on the S&P 500. I know that the stock market is not a perfect rational indicator of the health of the economy, but it's what we got. If you want a better measure of the actual health of the economy, the growth figures for Q1 came out a couple days ago, and the United States economy shrank by 0.3% just in the first quarter of this year. So that's a pretty big recession indicator. Hooray. Okay, so here we are, April 2nd, Liberation Day. Boom, 2 days later, April 4th. That drop right there is about 8%. Okay, so it was about an 8% drop over 2 days. That's really bad. Then at April 8 to 9, you notice a gigantic surge back upwards. This was actually, I think it broke the top 10 of largest single day stock rallies in US history. And Trump, of course, was bragging about it and yada, yada, yada. Why did this happen? Because he essentially took all of these tariffs that were ridiculously high, and except for the one on China, he put them all at a blanket 10%, which, again, is still bad, but is nowhere near as devastating as having 48% on Laos and 24% on Malaysia and other extremely high figures. So he essentially changed course, right? I mentioned at the beginning of the video I didn't want to make this video too early because I was afraid he would change course. This was his biggest course change, I think, to date, right? Now we've had some peaks and valleys, but the stock market was dipping pretty bad again until this past week or so, where there have been some signals going back and forth between China and the United States, the two largest economies on earth and the two formerly largest trading partners, that they were going to try and negotiate and work something out, and that is why the stock market is doing a little bit better. I think it's a false sense of reassurance. I think they're basically just hoping and praying, basically. We'll talk more about the negotiations here in a little bit. I want to zoom back in on this bump from April 8th to April 9th. A lot of people were questioning, why did Trump change course? Was it because Peter Navarro was, out of the room that day and they finally managed to get him in a room alone and we're like, hey, you gotta do something? I think this is the base indication. Okay. This is the US 10-year Treasury bond yield. What's a Treasury bond? Basically, when the government needs to borrow money, it issues Treasury bonds. Anybody can buy these Treasury bonds, American citizens, financial institutions, foreign governments, whatever. And this 0.38% interest rate is the cost of borrowing money for the federal government. Okay? So, when the stock market is doing very bad, the interest rate of a treasury bond usually goes down. Because if the stock market is very volatile, like it was during this period here, it's no longer seen as a safe investment, and so all the investors quietly start moving their money into treasury bonds, which increases the demand for treasury bonds, which lowers the yield. Okay? Or yield meaning the interest rate. However, if you'll notice here, from that same period where the stock market was in turmoil, the bond yield actually was increasing, and it kept increasing until that 8th through 9th sort of jump that we were talking about earlier. Why is that bad? Because it means that people who are pulling their money out of the stock market aren't reinvesting it into the treasury bond market. So what are they doing with it? They're taking their money out of the United States. They're investing in foreign companies, in buying up, euros or other foreign currencies, or they're investing in things like gold, right? So this was a very, very bad indicator for the economy, and that's why, I think it was on the 10th or 11th or 9th, somewhere in there, Trump basically reversed course on those drastic tariffs. Now, I can already see you typing in the comments, this is all just a negotiating tactic. You don't understand Trump's strategy, yada yada yada. We're gonna go through the negotiations and the issues that arise with them and why I don't think they will be particularly successful. The first problem is a problem of staffing, a problem of manpower. So basically, through Doge and other such purges, the upper echelons of all government institutions have been purged. Anybody who had any sort of experience or technical know-how running these organizations has been fired. Okay? Including in departments like the Commerce Department and the State Department and all of the departments responsible for, foreign trade. And they've, of course, been replaced by loyalists and sycophants who don't know anything, but at least won't counter what Trump says, won't know more than he knows, which is essentially nothing. So what that means is there's very few people in the entire United States government who are even able to do any of these negotiations, right? They've been bragging that, 80 countries or whatever are coming forward asking for negotiations. Well, it doesn't matter how many countries come forward if nobody's able to negotiate with them. Like nobody's like physically like present there for the negotiations. Normally, a trade deal like this takes like years to organize, right? Like NAFTA or the USMCA. Both of those took like years and, dozens of staff members going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, negotiating the finer points. Now we don't have the ability to do any of that. Not only do we not have time, we don't have the manpower. The only people that are able in Trump's administration to negotiate are Trump himself, right? He's the president. Secretary of Commerce Howard Lutnick, whose name comes up a lot. And the Secretary of the Treasury, Scott Bessent, who is basically just a coward and he's a yes man. Like whatever Trump says goes. Trump says tariffs, he says tariffs. Trump says whatever, he says how high, right? And there's also Peter Navarro, who isn't shown here. Peter Navarro is like a special government employee specifically focused on trade and industry. Okay, so that's 4 people. 4 people in the entire Trump administration are even able or have the authorization or have the power to negotiate with anyone. And that's very bad. Never mind the actual competence of these people, which, for most of them, let's just say is less than the average American middle schooler. There just isn't enough people to negotiate with the entire world. I mean, that's just the simple fact of the matter. All right, then we get to the second problem, which is the fact that, like, the Trump administration is not negotiating in good faith. What do I mean by that? So in the very early days before the Liberation Day, he asked Mexico and Canada to crack down on illegal border crossings and fentanyl, right? And if they didn't comply, he was going to impose a 25% tariff on them, okay? In the beginning, Canada said, yes, we'll do that. They appointed a fentanyl czar. They did a couple other things. And the president of Mexico basically told Trump to shove it, okay? What was the end result? Both countries were hit with the exact same 10% tariff. Now, think about this for a second. If the negotiations are designed to produce a specific outcome, a specific behavioral change, but whether that behavioral change happens doesn't retroactively affect the negotiations, what's the point of having a negotiation? In other words, if you had to do 10 push-ups, otherwise, and you got a cookie, but then you didn't do the push-ups and you got the cookie anyways, what's the point of doing the push-ups? What's the point of negotiating? If the Trump administration is going to punish you either way, then there's no point in listening to any of their demands, anything that they have to say. Funnily enough, now the situation is reversed. Now Canada's the one that's more militantly fighting the trade war, fighting against the tariffs, whereas Mexico's kind of being brought alongside. But again, this is in reference to the early days of this whole debacle. Okay. And yeah, with Mark Carney's election, trust me, the Canadians are going to respond, and they're going to respond big, and they are not going to just simply roll over and allow themselves to become like an economic colony of the United States. Yeah, that's not going to happen. So then we have a country like Vietnam. A lot of the recent economic growth in Vietnam is due to investments that were made in the country as a response to COVID, right? So when COVID first happened, everybody realized that maybe having their entire supply chain for literally every product on Earth go through a authoritarian country that could, shut down their entire economy with a snap of their fingers probably wasn't a good idea. And also Vietnam had cheaper labor costs. And so a lot of companies began moving their manufacturing down to Vietnam. Then Trump comes along with his 46% tariff, which, yeah, that's a ton, right? And again, Vietnam's not a wealthy country yet. They may be in 10 years, but for now, they really can't afford to buy all of the American products. So they have a massive trade deficit with us. Now, when Liberation Day first happened, because Vietnam is one of the countries that relies on the United States military as a counter to China most heavily, right? They're very, very opposed to China, geopolitically and militarily, and so is the U.S. And a country that relies so heavily on exporting, clothes and manufactured goods to the United States. They were one of the first countries to approach the U.S. after Liberation Day and say, hey, we listened and we're here and we want a trade deal and we're offering 0% tariffs on everything you sell, and then we get 0% tariffs on everything that we sell. Now, if the stated goal was to reduce unfair trade barriers, reduce tariffs on American goods, then it appears that Trump has succeeded. So did Trump take the deal? No. He picked the goalposts up and moved them and said, actually, that's not okay. You need to stop China routing goods through your economy. Also, you need to stop stealing our intellectual property. And he just made a bunch of other demands. So again, what's the point of trying to negotiate in good faith if after you have, given in, Trump just moves the goalpost and says, screw you, we want more anyway? There's no point. It really disincentivizes negotiations for all countries. All right, now we get to the big one, China. So, Liberation Day, we slapped on 125% tariffs. As the weeks were on, that number kept going progressively higher and higher and higher. I believe we are now at 245% tariffs, which is not quite an embargo, but is pretty freaking close. The Trump administration has repeatedly said that they are waiting for the Chinese to reach out, waiting for them to try and make a deal, but that kept not happening. So now Trump's camp is the one that's apparently reaching out. However, the Chinese have decided, according to reports I've seen, have decided to wait it out, because you can't start negotiations if both parties don't know what they want out of negotiations. And the Trump, overarching idea on what exactly they want China to do has always been vaguely defined, very ill-defined. And there's conversations happening between, Scott Bessent, Peter Navarro, Trump, right now, trying to figure out exactly what direction to go. So the Chinese have basically said, while those internal conflicts are raging on in the Trump administration, we're just going to sit back and watch because it's pointless to try and negotiate if they're just going to change their minds. Now, because China has such harsh tariffs levied against it, we're seeing a decrease in the number of cargo ships coming into ports like Long Beach, Los Angeles, and Seattle, like I mentioned. Also, some of the cargo ships that are coming have far lower quantities of cargo. So they're maybe 20, 30% empty. Yeah, so roughly speaking, currently, year to date, the amount of cargo being shipped into the West Coast is down about 40%, which is significant. I mean, we're talking millions of tons of cargo here. Now, do the American tariffs hurt China? Absolutely. The answer is absolutely. Okay? But there is kind of a caveat to that, right? So, first of all, the Chinese have put reciprocal tariffs on us. I think it's 125%. They basically said they're not going to go any higher because 125% tariffs on the U.S., whose goods are already expensive, is effectively an embargo, right? It pretty much just shuts down all trade. So, China has 31.63% of the entire global share of manufacturing. And that's manufacturing in terms of value, not necessarily in like industrial capacity, right? So like manufacturing like cheap plastic Temu crap is less valuable than manufacturing like trucks, for example. So in terms of like not the super high end stuff, but like the mid range products that the entire world consumes, China is by far the leader in that. So the way I think about this is the United States is going to be the loser in the long run of any trade war against China, and there are a couple of reasons for that. The first, as we can see by this graph, or this chart, I should say, 31.63% of global manufacturing. The United States is not 31% of the global consumption. Okay, we don't have 31% of the people. We don't have 31% of the purchasing power, of the buying power of the entire world. Basically, what that means is China can sell their goods to other countries. Sure, they probably won't make as much money selling to, you know, Australia or to Japan or to India or whatever, but they'll still be able to find destinations for most of their products, although, again, in the short term, their economy undoubtedly will take a hit. The United States can't really buy a lot of the products that China makes from other places. There's been a lot of talk recently about iPhones. Foxconn manufactures all of the iPhones in China, and there's talk of Apple moving to India, moving their production to India. But the problem with that is the Foxconn company has decades of technical experience and know-how and technology and machine tools, and you can't just replicate all of that overnight. You can't just pack all of that up into a factory in India and have it all just magically work out. And iPhones are one of the products that people expect to be extremely good quality, right? Nobody's going to buy like a shitty, malfangled iPhone that like one of the camera lenses is loose and it falls apart. Yeah, people aren't gonna buy that. So if you want to, in other words, I don't know how you're going to replicate the high precision standard of manufacturing that Foxconn is able to do with iPhones in India, especially on like a short time frame. Maybe in 10 years they'll get there, but for the next, I don't even know, like 5 years, I doubt if we'll get anything close to acceptable. Okay? So that's part of the issue here. Another problem is resources like rare earth minerals, right? So China has threatened to cut off, or I think they actually did cut off, exports of rare earth elements to the United States. Why is that important? These rare earth elements are used in batteries, especially battery miniaturization. So if you're doing drones or anything that needs a power source but needs a power source that's very light, these rare earth elements are extremely, extremely important. Not only does China have a lot of rare earth elements like in the ground, they also produce they refine most of the world's supply of a lot of different metals. Cobalt is big in that one. The cobalt is mined in the Democratic Republic of the Congo and then is shipped to China to be refined and then sold to the rest of the world. Cobalt again goes towards making batteries, but typically they're the big bulky kind like you would find in like a Tesla EV or something like that. So a lot of these products that we're tariffing, we simply can't buy them from other countries because nobody else refines as much cobalt as China. Nobody else produces as much, rare earth elements, lithium, whatever. So yeah, that's another huge issue right there. One last thing. There is a secret weapon that all of our allies have in trade negotiations with us. And it is something that Japan has threatened to do. It is something that China is already doing, and that is selling U.S. government bonds. If they start selling U.S. government bonds, it will dramatically crash the price of the dollar, and that is already happening. Let's see, dollar index. As we can see since the start, oh man, it's even down today. As we can see since the start of this whole Liberation Day fiasco, which was, let's see, about right here, the dollar has lost about 4% of its value. And most of that is due to foreign governments. Not most of it, but a lot of it is due to foreign governments selling government bonds. What that will do is that will make it even more difficult for everybody in the US to import things, because now our currency is worth less on the global market. It will also make it harder for the United States to service its debts, because the money they have to repay those debts, again, is just worth less. So that's something that, again, China's already doing. Other countries, I'm sure, are doing it, but they're probably being sneakier about it. And Japan has actively said, like, we're going to do this if we don't get what we want out of a trade deal. So every country in the world essentially has a big red button that they can all press at the same time to severely damage the U.S. economy. They have the sword of Damocles over our head collectively. All right, we're in the home stretch now. We're almost done, I promise. So we've discussed how tariffs are bad macroeconomically. We've discussed how I don't think negotiations are going to result in anything positive, really. But at the end of the day, the justification for all of this is the revival of the United States manufacturing industry. Now, do I think that tariffs will lead to a revival of the United States manufacturing industry? The answer is maybe, but there's a lot of problems with that idea. The first and foremost is that, if you're trying to stimulate domestic manufacturing, what you really want to do is you want to tariff only the finished goods, right? You want to tariff the finished products like lamps or televisions or iPhones or cars, stuff that comes out at the end of the assembly line. You don't want to tariff the things that go into the assembly line. Steel, aluminum, oil, rubber. All of those things are input costs. But because Trump has signed, a 25% tariff on all steel and aluminum collectively around the world, that is going to make the cost of building any factory, of starting up any industry, more expensive, which is going to discourage the growth of industry. Okay, so even though I don't like tariffs, there's a right way to do tariffs, and they are not doing it the right way. Okay, let's put it like that. Another issue is automation, right? So they keep saying jobs, 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 jobs. We're going to bring the jobs back to West Virginia. We're going to bring the jobs back to Ohio. What jobs? Like, this isn't the 60s anymore. If you go into a car factory, a modern day car factory, like, in the 1920s, that would have employed hundreds of people. Now it employs like 40, right? Because robots do most of the work, and you have like a plant manager and people to operate the machines and people to repair the machines and like a janitor and maybe an electrician and a couple other guys. But basically the idea of having a vast assembly line crammed full of workers doesn't really exist anymore. And then that's not even dimensioning the whole AI revolution that, bubble or not, is going to change, is eventually going to trickle down into manufacturing and fundamentally change the manufacturing space in ways that we can't even comprehend right now. Right? So in terms of like job growth, job production, I just don't see it being anywhere close to what some people imagine. And then there's also I'll use TSMC as an example. So I think it was like the day after Trump was inaugurated, he made this press conference where TSMC agreed to invest $165 billion into the United States, building new chip fabrication plants, even though they had already planned to make a major investment in the U.S. under Biden's CHIPS Act, but whatever. And this was hailed as a big win. But the thing people don't understand about this is manufacturing semiconductors this precisely on scales of literal nanometers takes enormous skill, enormous technical expertise. We simply don't have the labor force in the United States that's been trained to do this kind of work. So at least at first, sure, they're going to build all these new fabs, but they're going to staff them with Taiwanese people because it's cheaper to relocate a Taiwanese worker to America than it is to train a American chip manufacturer from the ground up. Now, maybe as the years wear on and that plant operates smoothly, that calculation will change and maybe they'll start hiring domestic workers and training them. But at least for the first couple years of this plant's operation, there's just no way they're going to be able to find the skilled laborers in America that they need, right? There's a complete mismatch between the demands of the labor market and the supply in the labor market in a lot of these cases. There's one more element to this, and I mentioned it in my last video, but it's important, so it bears repeating, and that is the element of time. Factories do not grow on trees. They do not sprout up in the middle of the night like mushrooms. They take years and years and years to build. So even though these tariffs have rewritten global supply chains, and sure, maybe for some businesses it makes sense now to manufacture things in the United States, but that's going to take 5 to 10 years in most cases, unless they do a really, really, rush job. And without any sort of spending on the government's part, so unlike Biden's CHIPS Act, the Trump administration is being completely hands-off in terms of giving public money to corporations to set up factories. That further disincentivizes people to relocate manufactories here, which leads us to so we're done with the jobs bit. This is going to be my conclusion, my final thoughts. The biggest problem with all of this is the uncertainty. Uncertainty is the single worst thing an economy can experience. It is poison. It is economic poison. So, what's the point of moving all of your manufacturing out of China and back to the United States, or moving all your manufacturing out of Vietnam and back to the United States, if 6 months from now or 3 months from now, or hell, even tomorrow, Trump's going to say, actually, all the tariffs on this country are canceled, or maybe they're doubled, or tripled, or, literally anything could happen. That's the problem, is that there's no consistency. And so everybody's essentially reading tea leaves, trying to predict what the Trump administration is going to do next. And that's just not a recipe for long-term stability, long-term thinking. And that is how these people who run these supply chains have to think. They always think long-term, right? So that's not going to help bring jobs back into the United States. Yes, all of these tariffs, even if it does result in products being made or sourced in the United States, those products will still be more expensive to you, the consumer. Even if we suddenly started building, PlayStation 4s or iPhones in America, those products are going to cost way more because the value of American labor is way higher than China, India, Vietnam, etc. So even if these jobs magically do come back, you're still going to be dealing with higher costs. Goods will also be more expensive because of what I mentioned earlier, tariffs on import costs, right? So for all the manufacturing that we already have here, it's going to be more expensive to manufacture anything because the raw materials used to make that thing, a lot of cases, come from outside the United States. And even if, again, we magically sourced that material, let's say copper, in the United States, which we could do, it's still going to be more expensive than buying it from a foreign country in pretty much every case, because that's how capitalism works, right? You always try and get the cheapest deal, the best deal, try and save the most money possible. And then the last thing I want to touch on is the just blatant corruption. I mean, before, let's go back to this. Before this giant single day increase in the stock market, Trump tweeted, or I should say, he posted on Truth Social, Truth, whatever the adjective is, verb is. He said "buy now," basically, and then an hour later he announced that he was rescinding a lot of the really punishing tariffs. And when other countries and other people see that the entire United States economy and government are in collaboration to basically rig the entire thing to enrich Trump and his cronies, it's going to make people think twice about doing any sort of investment. Corruption always damages the health of an economy, right? Because corruption effectively is like a parasite that drains economic productivity, economic resources from the wider economy and funnels it elsewhere. So this corruption problem, while still mostly in the background, right? It's not super blatant yet. I have a feeling it's only going to get worse. And I mean, we might even see cases where soon where Trump administration officials are just outright asking for bribes in exchange for, convincing Trump to ease off on this tariff or that tariff. All right, well, that about does it for me. If you made it to the end of this video, thank you so much. I hope that was in any way cohesive. Maybe not. We'll see. I'm sure I got some things wrong in this video. I'm almost positive I did. So please comment down below with any corrections that you have, especially some of the more technical aspects. Yeah. Okay. I'm working on part 3 of the Why Trump Won series. It'll be out, I don't want to give any specific dates, but I'm working on it. So look forward to that, and I will catch y'all on the flip side.